Have you ever found yourself in a moment where doing the right thing could cost you everything? I'm watching from wherever you are tonight, wondering if you've faced that choice. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from, because this story is about a woman who risked it all for a child she'd never met. The dinner rush at Palazzo Romano had finally died down to a manageable hum, but Valentina Rossi's feet still ached in her worn black flats as she wiped down table 12 for the third time that evening. The upscale Italian restaurant in Chicago's Little Italy demanded perfection from its staff, and after 18 months of working double shifts just to make rent, Valentina had perfected the art of invisible efficiency. She moved between tables like a shadow, refilling water glasses and clearing plates with the practiced grace of someone who couldn't afford to make mistakes. At 24, Valentina had learned that survival meant keeping her head down and her mouth shut. The world had taught her that lesson early and often, starting with a father whose fists spoke louder than words and continuing through a string of jobs where pretty young women were seen as disposable. But this job at Palazzo Romano paid better than anywhere else would hire someone without a college degree. And the tips from the wealthy clientele who frequented the establishment kept her small studio apartment and helped send money to her younger sister back in the old neighborhood. She tucked a strand of her long dark hair behind her ear as she approached table 7, where a little girl sat alone, her small frame nearly swallowed by the oversized burgundy booth. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old, dressed in an expensive navy dress with her thick black curls pulled back in an intricate braid that spoke of money and careful attention. But despite the obvious wealth displayed in her clothing and the gold bracelet that caught the restaurant's warm lighting, the little girl looked impossibly small and lonely. Valentina's heart clenched with familiar recognition. She knew that particular brand of solitude, the way it settled in your chest like a stone. The girl had been sitting there for nearly an hour, occasionally sipping from her glass of sparkling water and picking at the appetizer of bruschetta that had long since gone cold. Every few minutes, she would glance toward the restaurant's entrance with hope that quickly faded to disappointment. Valentina had watched this pattern repeat throughout her shift, fighting the urge to approach. The child was clearly waiting for someone important, and Palazzo Romano's strict policy was that servers didn't engage with customers beyond taking orders and delivering food. But something about the girl's quiet dignity reminded Valentina of herself at that age, waiting for a parent who might or might not remember to come home. The resemblance was too strong to ignore, too painful to pretend she didn't see. She was debating whether to risk checking on the child when Marcus Hoffman, the evening manager, emerged from the kitchen with his usual scowl firmly in place. Marcus was a thin man in his early 40s who wielded his small amount of authority like a weapon, particularly against the female staff members who couldn't afford to fight back. Valentina had learned to avoid him whenever possible, but she watched with growing alarm as his cold gray eyes fixed on table 7 and its solitary occupant. Marcus approached the little girl's table with the purposeful stride of someone looking for a problem to solve with maximum dramatic effect. Valentina moved closer, pretending to organize the silverware station while straining to hear the conversation. "You've been sitting here for over an hour," Marcus said to the child, his voice carrying the particular tone he reserved for people he considered beneath notice. "This is a restaurant, not a daycare center. If you're not ordering anything else, you need to leave." The little girl looked up at him with wide brown eyes that held far too much understanding for someone her age. "My papa said he would meet me here at 7:30, she said quietly, her accent carrying the musical lilt that marked her as a native Italian speaker. "He told me to wait." "Well, it's almost 9 o'clock now," Marcus replied with exaggerated patience that didn't hide his irritation. "Your papa clearly isn't coming. I need this table for paying customers." "But he said he would be here," the girl insisted, her small voice beginning to tremble. "He promised." Marcus leaned forward, lowering his voice in a way that somehow made his words more threatening rather than private. "Listen, kid, I don't care what promises your daddy made. This is a business, not a babysitting service. Either order a full meal right now or get out." The child's lower lip began to quiver, and Valentina saw her small hands clench into fists on the white tablecloth. "She's just a baby," Valentina thought, anger beginning to build in her chest like a slow fire. "A scared little girl whose father is late." and this bastard is treating her like she's some kind of criminal. Marcus straightened up and crossed his arms over his chest, clearly enjoying the power dynamic. I'm gonna count to 10, and then I'm calling security to escort you out. 1, 2, 3. The little girl's composure finally cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she shrank back into the booth, her small frame trembling with the effort of trying not to sob out loud. The sight of her obvious terror sent something protective and fierce roaring to life in Valentina's chest, overriding 18 months of careful self-preservation. "Stop it," Valentina said, stepping away from the silverware station and moving toward table 7. Her voice was quiet but carried clearly across the suddenly hushed dining room. "She's just a child." Marcus spun around to face her, his thin face flushing red with anger. "Excuse me, Rossi, did I ask for your opinion?" "She's been waiting for her father," Valentina continued, ignoring the warning bells going off in her head. "She's not bothering anyone. There's no reason to threaten her." The restaurant's ambient noise seemed to fade as other diners turned to watch the confrontation. Valentina was dimly aware that she was making a scene, breaking every rule about maintaining professional discretion, but she couldn't bring herself to care. The little girl was still crying, still pressed back against the booth like she expected to be struck, and something about her terror felt personal. Marcus took a step closer to Valentina, using his height advantage to loom over her in a way designed to intimidate. "The last time I checked, I was the manager and you were the waitress. Which means you do what I tell you to do when I tell you to do it. And right now, I'm telling you to mind your own business and go back to work." "My business is taking care of the customers," Valentina replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "And she is a customer. She's a child taking up a table that could seat 4 paying adults." Marcus snapped. "This isn't a charity. We're here to make money, not provide free babysitting for negligent parents." The little girl flinched at the word negligent, fresh tears streaming down her face, and Valentina felt something snap inside her chest. Without thinking, she moved to stand between Marcus and the booth, effectively shielding the child from his harsh stare. "You're scaring her," Valentina said quietly. "She's 8 years old and she's frightened. Whatever point you're trying to make, you've made it. Now back off." The silence that followed was deafening. Valentina could feel the weight of every eye in the restaurant, could practically hear Marcus calculating his response. She had just challenged his authority in front of witnesses, committed what he would certainly consider an unforgivable act of insubordination. But looking down at the little girl's tear-stained face, she found she didn't regret it. Marcus's voice, when he finally spoke, was deadly quiet. "You're fired, Rossi. Clean out your locker and get out of my restaurant. Now." The words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. Fired. Just like that, 18 months of perfect attendance and exemplary service meant nothing. The job that paid her rent, that kept her sister in school, that represented the closest thing to stability she'd ever known, was gone. But even as panic began to claw at her throat, Valentina found herself turning to the little girl instead of pleading for her job back. She crouched down beside the booth, bringing herself to eye level with the frightened child. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Valentina asked gently, reaching out to touch the girl's small hand. "Lucia," the child whispered, her accent making the name sound like music. "Lucia Torino." "Well, Lucia, I'm Valentina," she said with a smile that felt surprisingly genuine despite everything that had just happened. "And I want you to know that your papa didn't forget about you. Okay? Sometimes grown-ups get stuck in traffic or have important business that takes longer than they expect. But I can tell just by looking at you that you have a papa who loves you very much." Lucia nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "How can you tell?" "Because of the way you waited for him," Valentina explained, brushing a tear from the child's cheek with her thumb. "Girls who aren't loved don't wait that patiently. They don't have that much faith. But you do, which means you know your papa always comes back to you." A new voice cut through the moment like a blade, deep and carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "What exactly is happening here?" Valentina turned to see a man approaching from the restaurant's entrance, and her breath caught in her throat. He was tall, probably in his mid-30s, with broad shoulders that filled out his expensive black suit perfectly. His dark hair was styled with casual precision, and his olive skin suggested Mediterranean heritage. But it was his eyes that made her pulse stutter, a striking green-gray that seemed to take in every detail of the scene with laser-like intensity. "Papa!" Lucia cried out, scrambling from the booth and launching herself into his arms. "I waited just like you said. I didn't leave." The man caught his daughter effortlessly, lifting her up as she wrapped her arms around his neck. "Mi despias, piccola mia," he murmured against her hair, his voice soft with genuine remorse. "I'm sorry I'm late. Business took longer than expected." Valentina found herself staring at the obvious love between father and daughter, the way his entire demeanor softened when Lucia was in his arms. This was clearly a man who adored his child, which made Marcus's cruel treatment of her even more inexcusable. The man's attention shifted to Marcus, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "And you are?" Marcus straightened his tie nervously, clearly recognizing that he was dealing with someone important. "Marcus Hoffman, evening manager. I was just, managing the table situation. The child had been here for quite some time without ordering." She ordered bruschetta and sparkling water, Valentina found herself saying before she could think better of it. "And she's been perfectly well-behaved while waiting for her father." The man's intense gaze shifted to her, and she felt pinned by the weight of his attention. Something flickered across his features, an expression she couldn't quite read. "And you are?" "Valentina Rossi," she replied, lifting her chin slightly. "I was a server here until about 5 minutes ago." "Was?" he questioned, his voice dangerously quiet. "She was fired for interfering with restaurant policy," Marcus interjected quickly. "Servers are not supposed to involve themselves in management decisions." The man set Lucia down gently, keeping one protective hand on her shoulder. "Tell me exactly what management decision required my 80-year-old daughter to cry." The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Valentina watched Marcus realize he had made a terrible mistake. The man holding Lucia wasn't just any concerned parent. He was someone with power, someone whose displeasure could have serious consequences. Marcus's face went pale as he began to understand the magnitude of his error. "There was a misunderstanding about the table," Marcus stammered. I assumed that no one was coming to join her. "So you decided to threaten a child instead of simply asking if she needed anything?" the man asked with deadly calm. "Mr. Torino," Marcus began, clearly recognizing the name now, "I had no idea that Lucia was your daughter." If you had known what?" Dante Torino interrupted, his voice carrying a hint of accent that made his words sound even more dangerous. "That she deserved basic human decency because of who her father is. That children should be treated with kindness regardless of their family connections?" The name Torino sent a chill of recognition through Valentina. She had lived in Chicago long enough to know that name, to understand what it meant in certain circles. Dante Torino wasn't just wealthy. He was connected to the kind of power that operated in shadows and demanded absolute respect. Marcus had just terrorized the daughter of a very dangerous man. "And this young woman," Dante continued, his gaze shifting back to Valentina, "was fired for protecting my daughter?" "Yes, sir, but I can certainly reconsider that decision," Marcus said quickly, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. "Don't bother," Dante replied quietly. "Lucia, cara mia, can you wait for Papa by the front door for just a moment?" Lucia nodded and walked toward the entrance, leaving her father alone with Marcus and Valentina. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the quiet sounds of other diners pretending not to watch the drama unfolding. Dante reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his cell phone. "Tony? It's Dante. I need you to contact the owner of Palazzo Romano. Tell him I'm interested in purchasing his restaurant. Tonight. Yes, I know what time it is. Make it happen." He ended the call and looked directly at Marcus, whose face had gone from pale to gray. "You have 30 minutes to clean out your office before the transfer of ownership is complete. Don't ever let me hear about you working with children again." Marcus opened and closed his mouth like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. He stumbled backward, then turned and fled toward the kitchen, leaving Valentina alone with a man who had just bought an entire restaurant to fire someone who had threatened his daughter. Dante turned to her, and up close, she could see the carefully controlled anger simmering behind his calm exterior. "Miss Rossi, I believe I owe you a debt." "You don't owe me anything," Valentina replied quietly, still trying to process what had just happened. "Anyone would have done the same thing." "No," he said, shaking his head slightly. "They wouldn't have. And they didn't. You were the only person in this entire restaurant who had the courage to stand up for my daughter." Valentina felt her cheeks flush under his intense scrutiny. She looked around the dining room and realized he was right. Dozens of people had watched Marcus berate a frightened child, and she had been the only one to intervene. "Lucia is lucky to have a father who loves her so much," Valentina said, deflecting attention from her own actions. "She never doubted you would come." Dante's expression softened slightly. "She's everything to me. Her mother died when she was 3, and since then, it's been just the two of us. I would do anything to protect her." The raw honesty in his voice caught Valentina off guard. This was clearly a man accustomed to power and control, but when he spoke about his daughter, she could hear the vulnerability underneath the strength. It made him seem more human, more real. "You said you were fired," Dante continued. "Do you have other employment lined up?" Valentina almost laughed at the question. In her world, people didn't have backup plans or safety nets. They had desperation and the constant fear of falling through the cracks. "No," she admitted. "This was my only job." "Then I have a proposition for you," he said. "I need someone to help with Lucia. Someone who can be there when business keeps me away longer than planned. Someone who sees her as a person, not just the daughter of Dante Torino." The offer hung between them like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning. Valentina stared at him, trying to process the sudden shift from unemployment to what sounded like a legitimate job offer from one of the most powerful men in Chicago. "What kind of help?" she asked carefully, her survival instincts warring with her desperate need for income. "Companion, tutor, someone who understands what it's like to wait and worry," he replied. "Someone who would stand up to a grown man to protect a frightened child." Valentina looked toward the front door where Lucia waited, her small form silhouetted against the restaurant's warm lighting. The little girl had stopped crying, but Valentina could still see the lingering sadness in her posture, the way she held herself like someone accustomed to disappointment. Taking a job with Dante Torino would mean entering a world she knew was dangerous, aligning herself with a man whose reputation was built on foundations she probably didn't want to examine too closely. But it would also mean protecting a little girl who reminded her too much of herself, providing stability she desperately needed, and maybe finding a purpose beyond mere survival. "I accept," Valentina said quietly, sealing her fate with 2 simple words. 3 days later, Valentina stood in the marble foyer of the Torino estate, clutching her single duffel bag and trying not to gawk at the crystal chandelier that probably cost more than she had earned in her entire life. The house was a sprawling Mediterranean-style villa in one of Chicago's most exclusive neighborhoods, the kind of place she had only seen in magazines or movies about people whose problems were solved with money rather than prayer. Lucia appeared at the top of the curved staircase, her face lighting up with genuine excitement. "Valentina, you came." She practically skipped down the steps, her earlier sadness replaced by the irrepressible energy that seemed to be her natural state when she felt safe and loved. "Of course I came," Valentina replied, setting down her bag to accept Lucia's enthusiastic hug. "I promised I would be here to help with your schoolwork. Didn't I? Papa said you're going to live in the guest wing and that you know how to make real Italian pasta. Not the kind from the box?" Lucia chattered, taking Valentina's hand and beginning to tug her toward what appeared to be a formal living room. "He also said you stood up to that mean man at the restaurant because you thought I was scared." Valentina felt her heart clench at the casual way Lucia mentioned being frightened, as if it were a common occurrence she had learned to navigate. "You were scared, sweetheart. Anyone would have been. But you helped me anyway, even though you didn't know who I was." Lucia said with the kind of insight that seemed far beyond her 8 years. Papa says that means you have a good heart. Before Valentina could respond, Dante emerged from what looked like a study, his appearance more casual than it had been at the restaurant. He wore dark jeans and a simple gray sweater that somehow made him look more approachable while still maintaining an air of unmistakable authority. His green-gray eyes found hers immediately, and she felt that same flutter of awareness that had caught her off guard 3 nights ago. "Miss Rossi, I trust the room arrangements are acceptable?" he asked, moving toward them with the kind of fluid grace that suggested he was completely comfortable in his own space. "Everything is beautiful," Valentina replied honestly. "More than I expected or deserve." Something flickered across his features at her words, an expression that looked almost like disapproval. "You deserve to be treated with respect and kindness," he said quietly. "That's not negotiable in this house." The casual certainty in his voice made something warm unfurl in Valentina's chest. She had spent so many years expecting the worst from people, bracing herself for disappointment or cruelty, that genuine kindness felt almost foreign. But there was something about the way Dante looked at her, the same protective intensity he directed toward Lucia, that made her believe he actually meant what he said. "Can we show Valentina the garden?" Lucia asked, bouncing slightly on her toes with excitement. "And the library? And the kitchen where Maria makes the best tiramisu in all of Chicago?" "Lucia, Cara, let Miss Rossi settle in first," Dante said gently, but his smile took any sting out of the correction. "She's had a long few days." "Actually, I'd love to see everything," Valentina said quickly, not wanting to disappoint the little girl. "Besides, it's probably better if I learn my way around sooner rather than later." The next hour passed in a whirlwind of rooms that seemed to belong in a museum rather than a family home. Persian rugs covered gleaming hardwood floors, original artwork adorned the walls, and every piece of furniture looked like it had been selected by someone with impeccable taste and unlimited resources. But despite the obvious wealth on display, there were also clear signs that this was a home where a child lived and was loved. Lucia's artwork was prominently displayed on the refrigerator. Her books were scattered throughout the library, and her toys had claimed territories in nearly every room. "This is Mama's garden," Lucia announced as they stepped onto a stone terrace that overlooked an elaborate landscape of flowering plants and manicured pathways. "Papa keeps it exactly like she made it. He says it helps him remember her when he misses her too much." Valentina glanced at Dante and saw pain flicker across his features before he carefully schooled his expression back to neutrality. It was a brief glimpse beneath his controlled exterior, but it was enough to remind her that for all his power and wealth, he was still a man who had lost the love of his life and was raising their daughter alone. "Your mama had wonderful taste," Valentina said to Lucia, but her words were meant for Dante as well. "This is the most beautiful garden I've ever seen. She loved roses most of all," Lucia continued, pointing to an elaborate rose garden that was clearly the centerpiece of the entire space. "Papa says I look like her, but I think I look more like him." "You have your mama's smile and your papa's eyes," Valentina observed, earning a pleased giggle from Lucia and another one of those unreadable looks from Dante. That evening, after Lucia had been tucked into bed following what was apparently an elaborate bedtime routine involving 3 stories, 2 glasses of water, and a lengthy discussion about what she wanted to learn the next day, Valentina found herself alone in the kitchen with Dante. She had been making herself a cup of tea, still trying to adjust to the reality that she could help herself to anything in the impossibly well-stocked kitchen, when he appeared in the doorway. "How was your first day?" he asked, moving to the coffee maker with the easy familiarity of someone who spent a lot of time in this room despite having a housekeeper who could handle such tasks. "Overwhelming," Valentina admitted. "But good overwhelming, if that makes sense. Lucia is amazing. Bright and funny and so much more resilient than any 80-year-old should have to be. She gets that from her mother," Dante said quietly, his back turned to her as he worked. "Isabella was the strongest person I ever knew. She had to be, being married to someone like me." There was something in his voice, a weight of regret and loss that made Valentina's chest tighten with sympathy. She didn't know what to say to comfort a man who seemed so self-sufficient, so accustomed to handling everything alone. Lucia talks about her mother like she remembers her clearly, Valentina ventured carefully. That's a gift, having those memories. Isabella died of cancer when Lucia was 3, Dante replied, turning to face her with his coffee cup in hand. She fought for 2 years, long enough to make sure Lucia would have something to hold on to. Long enough to make me promise I would never let our daughter forget how much she was loved. Valentina felt tears prick at her eyes as she imagined a mother fighting to leave her child with enough love to last a lifetime. I'm sorry, she said softly. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been for both of you. Dante studied her for a long moment, his green-gray eyes searching her face for something she couldn't identify. You have experience with loss, he said finally. I can hear it in your voice. Everyone has experience with loss, Valentina replied carefully, not quite ready to share the details of her own painful history. It's just a matter of degree. But not everyone responds to it with kindness, Dante countered. Some people let it make them hard, bitter. You chose differently. Valentina wrapped her hands around her teacup, using the warmth to steady herself. Maybe I just haven't had enough loss to make me bitter yet. The look Dante gave her suggested he doubted that, but he didn't push. Instead, he asked, Are you comfortable with the tutoring arrangement? Lucia is ahead of most children her age academically, but she needs consistency. Structure. I can handle the academics, Valentina assured him. I was a good student before life got in the way. But I think what Lucia needs most is just someone who sees her as more than a responsibility to be managed. Something shifted in Dante's expression, a warmth that made him look younger and more approachable. That's exactly what she needs, he agreed. And what she's been missing. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the kitchen quiet around them except for the soft hum of expensive appliances. Valentina found herself studying Dante's face in the warm light, noting the laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than his reputation might indicate, the careful way he held himself even in his own home. Can I ask you something? Valentina said impulsively. Of course. Why me? She asked. I mean, you could hire anyone. Professional nannies, private tutors, people with credentials and references. Why trust your daughter to someone you met under such strange circumstances? Dante was quiet for so long that Valentina began to worry she had overstepped, asked something too personal or presumptuous. But when he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than offended. Because when my daughter was frightened and alone, you protected her without thinking about the consequences to yourself, he said. Because you saw a child who needed help and you helped, even when it cost you everything you had worked for. Because in 36 years of life, I've learned that character reveals itself in moments of crisis, and your character is exactly what I want influencing my daughter. The simple honesty of his words made Valentina's throat tighten with emotion. She had spent so many years feeling invisible, worthless, like her choices and actions didn't matter to anyone. To hear this powerful, successful man acknowledge her worth, to trust her with his most precious possession, felt like being handed something she hadn't even realized she was desperate for. I won't let you down, she said quietly. Either of you. I know you won't, Dante replied with quiet certainty. You're not capable of it. The next morning, Valentina was helping Lucia with her mathematics when Dante's phone rang with an urgent tone that immediately changed the atmosphere in the house. She watched his face go hard as he answered, his voice dropping to the cold, dangerous register she had heard briefly at the restaurant. Marcus Hoffman has been making inquiries, she heard him say to whoever was on the other end of the call. He's been asking questions about my family, about the girl who stood up to him. Handle it. Valentina felt ice form in her stomach. Marcus was looking for her, which meant her decision to protect Lucia had consequences she hadn't fully considered. She wasn't just Dante's employee now. She was connected to his world in ways that might make her a target. Dante ended the call and looked directly at her, reading the fear in her expression with uncomfortable accuracy. He's angry about being fired and he's looking for someone to blame, Dante said simply. But he won't be a problem much longer. The casual way he spoke about eliminating problems should have terrified her. Instead, Valentina found herself feeling safer than she had in years. Whatever Dante's business involved, whoever he really was beneath the expensive suits and careful courtesy. She was beginning to understand that his protection was absolute and his loyalty was earned through actions rather than words. As she watched him return to helping Lucia with a grammar exercise, his voice gentle and patient with his daughter, despite the dangerous phone call he had just fielded, Valentina realized she was in far deeper than she had intended. This wasn't just a job anymore. This was a life, a family, a world that operated by rules she didn't fully understand but found herself wanting to learn. And the man who controlled that world was looking at her like she belonged in it. 2 weeks into her new life at the Torino estate, Valentina found herself wandering the quiet halls long after Lucia had been tucked into bed. Sleep had become elusive. Her mind, too busy processing the dramatic shift her life had taken to settle into rest easily. Tonight was no different, and she made her way to the library, hoping that one of the countless books lining the elegant shelves might help quiet her restless thoughts. She was surprised to find the room already occupied. Dante sat in one of the leather armchairs near the fireplace, a glass of what looked like whiskey in his hand and papers scattered across the small table beside him. The warm light cast shadows across his face, highlighting the tension she was beginning to recognize as his constant companion during the evening hours when business demanded his attention. "I'm sorry," Valentina said softly, already turning to leave. "I didn't mean to disturb you." "You're not disturbing me," Dante replied, looking up from his papers with an expression that seemed almost relieved by the interruption. "Please stay. The numbers aren't making any more sense for my staring at them." Valentina hesitated in the doorway, aware that joining him would cross some invisible line from employee to something more personal. But the genuine welcome in his voice made the decision for her, and she moved to the chair across from his, tucking her legs beneath her in the oversized seat. "Can't sleep?" Dante asked, setting aside his papers and giving her his full attention. "Too much quiet," Valentina admitted with a rueful smile. "I know that probably sounds crazy, considering how peaceful it is here, but I'm not used to silence. Where I grew up, there was always noise. Sirens, shouting, music from the neighbors. The quiet here is so complete it's almost loud." Dante nodded with understanding that seemed deeper than mere politeness. "You grew up in a difficult neighborhood." "The South Side," Valentina confirmed, surprised by how easily the admission came. "My father worked construction when he could get it, which wasn't often enough. My mother cleaned office buildings at night. We lived in a studio apartment with paper-thin walls and neighbors who fought more than they slept." She paused, wondering why she was sharing details she rarely spoke about even to herself. But something about the way Dante listened, the quality of his attention, made her feel safe in a way that encouraged honesty. "What about family?" Dante asked gently. "Siblings?" "A younger sister, Lily. She's 18 now, in her first year of college on a partial scholarship." Valentina's voice softened with obvious affection. "She's brilliant, much smarter than I ever was. She's going to be a doctor someday, help people who can't afford to help themselves." "The way you helped her," Dante observed. "That's why you worked so many double shifts at the restaurant." Valentina felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassed by his perceptive observation. Someone had to make sure she had what she needed. Our parents weren't exactly reliable in the support department. There was a weight to those words that suggested far more than simple financial instability, and Dante's expression grew more serious. "Your father," he said carefully. "He was the reason you knew how to recognize when a child was frightened." The statement hung between them like a confession neither of them had spoken aloud. Valentina stared down at her hands, fighting the familiar shame that always accompanied memories of her childhood. She had never talked about her father's violence with anyone, had learned early that such admissions marked you as damaged goods in most people's eyes. "He drank," she said quietly, the words feeling rusty from lack of use. "And when he drank, he got angry. When he got angry, he hit whatever was closest. Usually my mother. Sometimes me. Never Lily, though. I made sure of that." Dante's jaw tightened, and she could see him processing the implications of her words. "That's why you stepped between Marcus and Lucia that night," he said with sudden understanding. "Not just because he was being cruel, but because you recognized the signs. I couldn't watch another child be terrorized by an adult who enjoyed the power imbalance, Valentina confirmed. Even if it cost me everything I had, I couldn't just stand by and let it happen. The silence that followed was heavy with emotion, and when Dante finally spoke, his voice was rough with something that sounded like barely controlled anger. No child should have to protect other children from adults who are supposed to keep them safe. You should have been protected, not forced to be the protector. The fierce conviction in his voice made Valentina look up, meeting his green-gray eyes directly for the first time since she had started talking. She saw pain there, the kind that came from understanding loss and injustice too intimately, and realized that he was sharing his own vulnerability by acknowledging hers. "What about you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What keeps you awake at night?" Dante was quiet for so long that Valentina thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if they were being pulled from some deep, carefully guarded place. "The fear that I'm failing her," he said simply, "that everything I do to protect Lucia, to provide for her, to give her the life Isabella wanted her to have, isn't enough. That someday she'll realize her father is a man who solves problems with violence and money, and she'll be ashamed of what I am." "But she adores you," Valentina protested, thinking of the way Lucia's face lit up whenever Dante walked into a room. "Anyone can see how much you love each other." "Love isn't always enough," Dante replied, taking a sip of his whiskey. "Isabella used to worry about the same things, used to ask me if I was sure this life was what I wanted for our daughter. I promised her I would give Lucia choices I never had, opportunities to be something other than what I became. But how can I do that when my world is the only one I know how to navigate?" The pain in his voice was so raw that Valentina felt tears prick at her eyes. She had never considered that someone with Dante's power and resources might struggle with the same fears that plagued everyone else, the universal worry of parents who wondered if they were doing right by their children. "You're giving her love and stability and a sense of security most children never have," Valentina said firmly. "You're teaching her that she matters enough to be protected, that her happiness is worth fighting for. That's not something to be ashamed of, even when the protection requires things that most people would consider unforgivable." Dante asked, his eyes searching hers. "When it means being someone who makes problems disappear in ways that don't bear close examination." The question hung between them like a test, and Valentina realized they had arrived at the moment she had been unconsciously preparing for since the night at the restaurant. This was when she would have to decide whether she could accept the reality of who Dante truly was, beyond the devoted father and careful gentleman she had come to know. "Everyone deserves to be protected," she said finally, "especially children like Lucia who never asked to be born into complicated circumstances. If you do violent things to keep violent people away from her, then that violence serves something good." The relief that flickered across Dante's features was so pronounced that Valentina realized he had been holding his breath, waiting for her judgment. He set his glass aside and leaned forward slightly, closing some of the distance between them. "You understand something that most people never grasp," he said quietly. "Sometimes protection requires getting your hands dirty. Sometimes being a good person means being willing to be seen as a bad one." The intensity in his voice, combined with his proximity, made Valentina acutely aware of the electricity that had been building between them for weeks. She could smell his cologne, could see the way his eyes had darkened as they held hers, could feel the pull of attraction that had been growing stronger with each conversation, each shared moment watching Lucia laugh. Dante seemed to be fighting the same awareness, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before returning to her eyes with visible effort. Valentina felt her breath catch, her heart beginning to race as she recognized the want in his expression, the same longing that had been building in her own chest. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her cheek with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his reputation for ruthlessness. Valentina leaned into the touch instinctively, her eyes fluttering closed as she allowed herself to feel the warmth of his skin against hers. "Valentina," Dante murmured, her name sounding like a prayer on his lips. She opened her eyes to find him watching her with an expression so tender it made her chest ache with longing. This was dangerous territory, she knew. allowing herself to fall for a man whose world operated by rules she barely understood, whose enemies might see her as a weakness to be exploited. But looking into his eyes, feeling the careful way he touched her like she was something precious, she found she didn't care about the danger. Dante leaned closer, his free hand coming up to frame her other cheek, and Valentina felt herself being drawn into his orbit like a moth to flame. She could feel his breath against her lips, could see herself reflected in his eyes, could practically taste the kiss that hung between them like an inevitability. The shrill sound of his cell phone shattered the moment like glass breaking. Dante closed his eyes and cursed softly in Italian before pulling back to answer the call. The professional mask slipped back into place so quickly that Valentina almost wondered if she had imagined the tender intimacy of moments before. "What is it, Marco?" Dante's voice was clipped, businesslike, but Valentina could hear the underlying frustration at the interruption. She watched his expression grow increasingly grim as he listened to whoever was on the other end of the call. When he finally spoke, his tone had shifted to something cold and dangerous that made the hair on her arms stand up. "How many men?" he asked quietly. "And they're sure it was the Constantino family?" Valentina felt her stomach drop at the mention of another family name, instinctively understanding that this was the kind of business call that meant violence was coming to their doorstep. "Double the security around the house immediately," Dante continued, "and find out how they knew about the shipment. Someone gave them information they shouldn't have had access to." He ended the call and looked at Valentina with an expression that was part apology, part resignation. "I have to go handle something," he said, already rising from his chair. "There's been a problem with one of my business operations." Valentina nodded, understanding that this was the reality of being involved with someone like Dante. His world didn't pause for romantic moments or personal desires. When duty called, everything else became secondary. But as she watched him gather his papers and prepare to leave, she realized that the interruption had changed something fundamental between them. They had acknowledged the attraction, had almost acted on it, and there would be no going back to the careful professional distance they had maintained before. "Be safe," she said quietly as he reached the library door. Dante paused, turning back to look at her with surprise at her obvious concern. "Always," he replied, but his voice carried a new warmth that made her pulse flutter. After he left, Valentina remained in the library for a long time, touching her cheek where his hand had been and trying to process what had almost happened. She was falling in love with a dangerous man, a man whose enemies might decide she was a liability worth eliminating. But for the first time in her life, she felt like she was worth protecting, worth fighting for, and that feeling was intoxicating enough to make the risk seem worthwhile. What she didn't know was that across town, Marcus Hoffman was meeting with representatives of the Constantino family, trading information about Dante's household routines and the new woman who had become important enough to live under his roof. The former restaurant manager had found allies in his quest for revenge, and Valentina's name was now on a list of people who could be used to hurt the man who had destroyed his career. The battle lines were being drawn, and she was about to discover that protecting Lucia at the restaurant had been just the beginning of the fight. The attack came 3 days later, swift and brutal in its efficiency. Valentina had been walking back from the small market a few blocks from the estate, enjoying the rare afternoon when Lucia was at a friend's house for a playdate and she had a few hours to herself. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of burning leaves and the promise of an early winter, and she had been thinking about the almost kiss in the library, about the way Dante's eyes had darkened with want before his phone had shattered the moment. She never saw the black sedan pull up alongside her. The first indication of danger was a car door slamming, followed immediately by rapid footsteps on the sidewalk behind her. Valentina's survival instincts, honed by years of navigating dangerous neighborhoods, screamed at her to run. But before she could react, a hand grabbed her arm with enough force to spin her around. 2 men faced her, both wearing the kind of cheap suits and cold expressions that marked them as muscle for hire rather than professionals. The taller one, a heavy-set man with graying hair and scars across his knuckles, smiled with the particular cruelty of someone who enjoyed intimidating women. "You must be the little waitress who cost Marcus Hoffman his job," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't place. He's very interested in having a conversation with you. I don't know what you're talking about, Valentina replied, trying to keep her voice steady while mentally calculating her chances of reaching the busy street 2 blocks away. Sure you don't, the second man said with a laugh that held no humor. You're gonna come with us quietly, or we're gonna make this a lot more unpleasant for everyone involved. Valentina saw the silver flash of a knife in his hand and felt ice settle in her stomach. These weren't random muggers or opportunistic criminals. They knew who she was, knew about Marcus, which meant they had been watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. She was about to scream, hoping someone would hear and call for help, when the sound of squealing tires filled the air. A black SUV careened around the corner, moving fast enough to scatter pedestrians and draw startled shouts from nearby shopkeepers. The vehicle stopped with precision between Valentina and her attackers, and Dante emerged from the passenger side with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to violence. He wasn't dressed for business today. Instead, he wore dark jeans and a leather jacket that made him look younger and infinitely more dangerous. The 2 men immediately shifted into defensive positions, but Valentina could see the uncertainty in their eyes. Whatever they had been paid to grab her, it clearly hadn't been enough to make them eager to face Dante Torino in person. Gentlemen, Dante said with deadly calm, moving to stand between Valentina and the men who had been threatening her. I believe you have something that belongs to me. The taller man recovered first, puffing out his chest in a display of bravado that fooled no one. This is just business, Torino. Nothing personal. Marcus wants to settle some old scores. Marcus Hoffman is a dead man, Dante replied without raising his voice. But that's a problem for later. Right now, you have exactly 5 seconds to get back in your car and drive away before this becomes a problem for you personally. You think you can intimidate us just because you have a reputation? The second man sneered, shifting his grip on the knife. There are 2 of us and 1 of you. Dante smiled, and Valentina felt a chill run down her spine at the expression. It wasn't pleasant or reassuring. It was the smile of a predator who had just been given an excuse to do what came naturally. 2 of you, he agreed. But I'm not alone. As if summoned by his words, 3 more men emerged from the SUV, moving with the coordinated precision of a military unit. They didn't draw weapons or make threats. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to shift the balance of power so dramatically that Valentina's attackers immediately began backing toward their sedan. This isn't over, the tall man called out as they retreated, but his voice lacked conviction. We know where to find her. No, Dante said quietly, his words carrying easily across the distance. You don't, because after today, she's going to be somewhere you'll never think to look, surrounded by people who will kill you for breathing the same air she breathes. And Marcus? He made this personal when he threatened my family. Give him that message. The sedan sped away, leaving Valentina standing on the sidewalk with shaking hands and a racing heart. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 3 minutes, but it had changed everything. She was no longer just Dante's employee or even his potential romantic interest. She was a target, someone his enemies would use to hurt him. Dante turned to her immediately, his hands gentle as he checked her for injuries, despite the violence that had been radiating from him moments before. Are you hurt? Did they touch you? I'm fine, Valentina managed, though her voice was shakier than she would have liked. How did you know to come? How did you find me so fast? I have people watching the neighborhood, Dante explained, his hands still moving over her arms and shoulders, as if he needed physical confirmation that she was unharmed. When Marcus started making threats, I increased security. But I should have anticipated this. I should have protected you better. The self-recrimination in his voice cut through Valentina's shock, and she reached up to touch his cheek, forcing him to meet her eyes. You saved me, she said firmly. You came when I needed you. Something shifted in Dante's expression, the careful control he maintained slipping just enough to let her see the fear underneath. For a moment, he had thought he might lose her, and the possibility had shaken him more than any business threat ever could. Without thinking, without considering consequences or propriety or the fact that they were standing on a public street surrounded by his men, Valentina rose on her toes and kissed him. The kiss was desperate, fueled by adrenaline and gratitude, and the sudden crystal-clear understanding that life was too short to waste time pretending she didn't want this man with every fiber of her being. Dante responded immediately, his arms coming up to wrap around her as he deepened the kiss, pouring all of his relief and fear and want into the connection between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Valentina saw her own recognition reflected in his eyes. This was the point of no return, the moment when everything changed from possibility to inevitability. "Come home with me," Dante said quietly, his forehead resting against hers. "Let me keep you safe." The drive back to the estate passed in charged silence, both of them acutely aware that they had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Valentina found herself studying Dante's profile as he drove, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel like he was fighting for control. When they reached the house, Dante dismissed his security team with quiet efficiency before turning to face her in the marble foyer where this had all begun 3 weeks ago. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows made his green-gray eyes look almost silver, and Valentina felt her breath catch at the intensity of his gaze. "Valentina," he said carefully, "I need you to understand what this means. If we do this, if we become what I think we both want to become, there's no going back to the way things were. My enemies will always see you as a weakness they can exploit. My world will always be dangerous for someone I care about." "I know," she replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, "and I understand what you're telling me. But Dante, I've been in danger my whole life. At least with you, it's danger that comes from being loved instead of being worthless." The word hung between them, more powerful than any declaration either of them had made before. Loved, not just wanted or desired or protected, but loved with the kind of fierce devotion that made safety feel possible even in the midst of chaos. Dante moved toward her slowly, giving her time to change her mind, to step back, to decide that the risk was too great. Instead, Valentina met him halfway, her hands fisting in the leather of his jacket as she pulled him down to her level. This kiss was different from the one on the street. Slower, deeper, full of promise and intent rather than desperate relief. Dante's hands tangled in her hair, and Valentina could feel the careful leash he kept on his control beginning to fray. "Are you sure?" he asked against her lips, his voice rough with want. "Because once I touch you, once I make you mine, I'm never going to be able to let you go." "I don't want you to let me go," Valentina whispered back, and felt him shudder against her at the admission. He lifted her then, carrying her up the curved staircase toward his bedroom with a reverence that made her feel precious instead of conquered. The afternoon sun slanted through tall windows, casting everything in warm gold light that made the moment feel dreamlike, removed from the violence that had brought them to this point. Dante set her down beside his bed, his hands framing her face as he looked into her eyes with an expression so tender it made her chest ache. "You're beautiful," he said quietly, "so beautiful it terrifies me." Valentina felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming realization that someone saw her as worthy of protection, worthy of gentleness, worthy of love. She had never experienced that before, had never known what it felt like to be cherished instead of merely tolerated. She began to unbutton his shirt with trembling fingers, and he caught her hands gently. "We don't have to rush this," he said. "We have time." "I know," she replied, meeting his gaze directly. "But I want to. I want you to know that I trust you completely, that I choose you, despite everything that comes with it." The next hour passed in a haze of gentle touches and whispered endearments, of Dante showing her with infinite patience what it meant to be loved by someone who would rather die than hurt her. He worshipped her body with a reverence that made her feel like something sacred, and when they finally came together completely, it felt like coming home to a place she had never known she was looking for. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the warm afternoon light, Valentina traced patterns on Dante's chest and marveled at how safe she felt despite knowing that Marcus and his allies were somewhere out there planning their next move. "What are you thinking about?" Dante asked softly, his fingers combing through her hair in a rhythm that was becoming familiar. "How different this feels from what I always expected," she admitted. I thought being with someone would feel like losing myself, but this feels like finding myself instead. Dante tightened his arms around her, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. You found yourself long before you found me, cara mia. You just needed someone who could see what was already there. The sound of a car in the driveway interrupted their peaceful afternoon, and Dante was instantly alert, reaching for the phone on his nightstand to check with security. His face relaxed when he confirmed it was just Lucia returning from her playdate, but the moment had reminded them both that their world was bigger than just the two of them. Papa, Lucia called from downstairs, her voice bright with excitement. Valentina, I have so much to tell you about Emma's new puppy. They dressed quickly, both smiling at the little girl's enthusiasm, and made their way downstairs to find Lucia practically bouncing with energy in the foyer. But when she looked at them, really looked, her 80-year-old perceptiveness picked up on something different immediately. You both look happy, she said with the kind of directness that only children possessed. Different happy, like Mama used to look when Papa brought her flowers. Dante and Valentina exchanged a glance, both realizing that their newfound intimacy was apparently obvious to anyone who cared to look. But instead of embarrassment, Valentina felt only warmth at being included in the same category as Isabella, the woman whose love had shaped both Dante and Lucia. Come tell us about the puppy, Piccola, Dante said, swooping Lucia up in a hug that made her giggle. And then we'll make dinner together, all three of us. The evening that followed was one of perfect domestic happiness, the kind of family moment that Valentina had dreamed of, but never expected to experience. They cooked pasta together, Lucia chattering about her day while Dante and Valentina moved around the kitchen with the easy coordination of partners who had found their rhythm. For a few hours, it was possible to forget about Marcus and threats and the dangerous world that existed beyond the walls of their sanctuary. It wasn't until Lucia had been tucked into bed, her head full of stories and her heart full of the security that came from being surrounded by people who loved her, that Dante's phone rang with the call that would shatter their newfound peace. He answered with his usual professional greeting, but Valentina watched his face go white with an emotion she had never seen before. Pure, undiluted terror. Where is she? Dante demanded, his voice breaking slightly on the words. How long ago? The one-sided conversation that followed made no sense to Valentina, but the increasing desperation in Dante's voice told her everything she needed to know. Something had happened to Lucia. When he finally ended the call, Dante turned to face her with an expression that looked like death itself. Marcus has her, he said simply. He took her from Emma's house an hour ago. He left a message saying he wants to trade her life for yours. The bottom dropped out of Valentina's world. While they had been making love and playing house and pretending that happiness was possible, Marcus had been planning his ultimate revenge. He had taken the one person in the world who mattered more than anything else, and it was entirely her fault for bringing this danger into Lucia's life. I have to go to him, Valentina said immediately, already moving toward the door. I have to trade myself for her. No, Dante said firmly, catching her arm and pulling her back. Absolutely not. That's exactly what he wants, and it won't save Lucia anyway. Men like Marcus don't honor deals. He'll kill you both. Then what do we do? Valentina asked, desperation clawing at her throat. She's just a baby, Dante. She must be so scared. We get her back? Dante replied, and for the first time since answering the phone, his voice carried the cold certainty that had made him one of the most feared men in Chicago. We get her back, and we make sure Marcus never threatens anyone we love ever again. As if summoned by his words, the house began filling with men, Dante's crew arriving with the kind of swift efficiency that spoke to years of preparation for exactly this type of crisis. Valentina watched in amazement as her lover transformed into the strategist and leader she had only heard whispers about, coordinating a rescue operation with military precision. But even as she witnessed Dante's competence and power, even as she felt hope begin to bloom in her chest at the sight of resources being mobilized to save Lucia, one thought echoed through her mind with devastating clarity. If anything happened to that little girl because of her, because she had been selfish enough to want love and family and safety, she would never forgive herself. And judging by the look in Dante's eyes as he planned their assault on Marcus's position, if Lucia was harmed, there wouldn't be enough of Marcus left to forgive. The abandoned warehouse in Cicero looked exactly like the kind of place where bad things happened and bodies disappeared. Valentina crouched behind the black SUV, her heart hammering against her ribs, as she watched Dante's men take their positions around the building with the silent efficiency of a military operation. The afternoon had faded to dusk, casting everything in long shadows that made the industrial landscape look even more menacing. Despite Dante's initial refusal to let her anywhere near the rescue operation, Valentina had eventually worn him down with a combination of logic and desperation. She knew Marcus better than anyone on Dante's crew, understood his particular brand of cruelty and cowardice. More importantly, if something went wrong, if Lucia was hurt or worse, Valentina needed to be there. The guilt of bringing this danger into their lives was eating her alive, and sitting safely at home while others risked their lives to fix her mistake was unacceptable. Marco, Dante's second-in-command, appeared at her elbow with a Kevlar vest and a grim expression. "The boss wants you wearing this," he said quietly, helping her into the protective gear. "And he wants me to remind you that, if things go sideways, you stay behind cover and let us handle it." "Understood," Valentina replied, though they both knew she would do whatever was necessary to help save Lucia, regardless of her own safety. Dante approached them with the focused intensity of a man preparing for war. His expensive suits had been replaced by tactical gear that made him look like what he truly was beneath the civilized veneer. A predator who had built his reputation on the willingness to do whatever violence was necessary to protect what belonged to him. "The building has 3 entrances," he explained in a low voice, pointing to the warehouse's layout on a tablet. "Marcus has at least 4 men inside, plus himself. Thermal imaging shows Lucia in the northwest corner, 2nd floor. She appears to be unharmed but restrained." Valentina felt a surge of relief so strong it nearly buckled her knees. Lucia was alive, which meant there was still hope, still a chance to undo the damage her presence in their lives had caused. "How do we get to her?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "We go in fast and hard from all 3 sides," Dante replied. "No negotiation, no demands. Marcus had his chance to walk away when I warned him off. He chose escalation." The cold finality in Dante's voice should have frightened her. Instead, Valentina felt only a fierce satisfaction that Marcus would finally pay for terrorizing an innocent child. He had spent weeks planning his revenge, savoring the anticipation of hurting Dante through the people he loved. Now he was about to learn that some men were far more dangerous than restaurant managers could imagine. Tony's voice crackled through the communications headset. "All teams in position. Thermal shows no movement from the targets. They might not know we're here yet. That won't last long," Dante replied grimly. "Remember, everyone inside except the child is considered hostile. No mercy, no survivors. This ends tonight." The assault began with coordinated precision that spoke to years of experience in exactly this type of operation. Dante's men moved like ghosts, appearing at windows and doorways with weapons drawn before Marcus's hired thugs even realized they were under attack. The sound of breaking glass and splintering would echo across the warehouse district, punctuated by shouts of alarm and the distinctive crack of gunfire. Valentina followed Dante through the main entrance, staying close behind his broad shoulders as they navigated the maze of shipping containers and industrial equipment that filled the warehouse floor. The air smelled of rust and motor oil, with an underlying scent of fear and desperation that made her stomach churn with anxiety. They found the stairwell leading to the 2nd floor just as Marcus's voice echoed through the building, high and panicked with the realization that his carefully laid trap had become his own cage. "Torino, you come up here alone or I put a bullet in the kid's head. I mean it. I've got nothing left to lose." Dante paused at the bottom of the stairs, his jaw tight with barely controlled fury. The man who had built his reputation on cool calculation was struggling with the primal rage that came from having his child threatened. Valentina could see the war playing out behind his green-gray eyes, the tension between tactical thinking and a father's desperate need to tear apart anyone who dared to hurt his daughter. "He's bluffing," she said quietly, her hand touching his arm. Marcus is a coward. He terrorizes children and women because he's too weak to face real threats. But he won't actually hurt Lucia because he knows that would be signing his own death warrant. Dante looked at her with surprise, as if he hadn't expected tactical insight from someone he still thought of as needing protection. But Valentina had spent her entire life reading dangerous men, understanding their motivations and weaknesses. Marcus was no different from her father or any of the other bullies who had shaped her childhood. "You're right," Dante said after a moment, recognition and respect flickering in his expression. He needs her alive to have any leverage at all. More gunfire erupted from somewhere deeper in the warehouse, followed by a scream that was abruptly cut short. Dante's men were systematically eliminating resistance, moving through the building like a cleansing fire that left no room for mercy or negotiation. "I'm coming up, Marcus," Dante called out, his voice carrying easily through the industrial space. "But you should know that your backup is already dead. It's just you and me now." The laugh that drifted down from the second floor was edged with hysteria. "Just like old times, then. Except this time, you're the one who's going to lose everything." Dante started up the stairs with fluid grace, his weapon held ready but not aimed directly ahead. Valentina followed close behind, her own hands empty but her heart full of fierce determination. Whatever happened next, she was not leaving this warehouse without Lucia safe in her arms. They found Marcus in a makeshift office area that had been created by stacking shipping containers to form walls. He stood behind an overturned desk, one arm wrapped around Lucia's small frame and a pistol pressed against her temple. The little girl's eyes were wide with terror, but Valentina could see the stubborn set of her jaw that marked her as Dante's daughter. Even at 8 years old, Lucia Torino was not going to give her captors the satisfaction of breaking completely. "Papa," Lucia whispered when she saw Dante, relief and hope flooding her voice. "I'm here, piccola mia," Dante replied, his tone gentle despite the weapon in his hands. "Everything is going to be okay now." Marcus's face was slick with sweat, his expensive suit rumpled and stained with what looked like blood from a cut above his eye. The confident restaurant manager who had enjoyed exercising petty authority over his employees was gone, replaced by a desperate man who had finally pushed too far and found himself facing consequences he couldn't escape. "You destroyed my life," Marcus said, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and fear. "One little bitch standing up to me, and suddenly I'm unemployable in this entire city. Do you have any idea what that's like? Losing everything because some nobody waitress couldn't mind her own business?" Valentina felt anger flare in her chest at hearing Lucia referred to in such terms, but she forced herself to remain calm. Marcus was unraveling, which made him dangerous in unpredictable ways. "You destroyed your own life when you decided to terrorize a child," Dante replied coldly. "Everything that happened after that was just consequences catching up with you." The sound of footsteps on metal stairs announced the arrival of Dante's men, and Marcus's grip on Lucia tightened reflexively. The little girl winced but didn't cry out, showing a courage that made Valentina's heart swell with pride and break with sympathy simultaneously. "Call them off," Marcus demanded, swinging his gun between Dante and the stairwell. "Tell them to back away or I swear I'll do it. She means more to you than some stupid business dispute." "You're right," Dante said quietly, lowering his weapon slightly. "She does mean more to me than anything, which is why you're already a dead man, Marcus. The only question now is whether you take her with you or if you're smart enough to let her go and face what's coming alone." Marcus's laugh was high and brittle, the sound of a man whose sanity had finally snapped under pressure. "Smart enough? I was smart enough to figure out your weakness, wasn't I? Smart enough to realize that the great Dante Torino could be brought to his knees by threatening one little girl and her precious protector." His gaze shifted to Valentina, and she saw recognition dawn in his eyes. The waitress who had humiliated him, cost him everything he thought he deserved. In Marcus's twisted worldview, she was the architect of his downfall, rather than someone who had simply tried to protect a frightened child. "This is all your fault," he snarled at her. "If you had just minded your own business, kept your mouth shut like a good little employee, none of this would have happened." "You're right," Valentina said suddenly, stepping forward despite Dante's sharp gesture for her to stay back. It is my fault. I'm the one who interfered at the restaurant. I'm the one who got you fired. If you want revenge, take it on me, not her. Dante's eyes widened with alarm as he realized what she was doing. Valentina, no, don't. But Valentina was already moving, walking toward Marcus with her hands raised and empty. She could see the calculation in his eyes, the temptation to trade one target for another. Marcus had wanted to hurt Dante by taking away someone he cared about, and she was offering herself as an alternative. You want to make me suffer? Dante continued, his voice carrying a note of desperate bargaining. Take her. Let Lucia go and take Valentina. She's the one who actually cost you your job. For a moment, Marcus actually seemed to consider the offer. His grip on Lucia loosened slightly as he focused on the woman who had become the symbol of everything that had gone wrong in his life. But then his face twisted with malicious glee as he realized the true extent of his power. Why should I choose? He asked with sick satisfaction. I can have both. I can make you watch me kill them both, starting with your precious daughter. It was exactly the wrong thing to say to a man like Dante Torino. The shot came from somewhere behind Valentina, precise and final. Marcus's body jerked backward, his weapon clattering to the floor as blood bloomed across his chest. He looked down at the spreading stain with surprise, as if he couldn't quite believe that his grand plan for revenge had ended with such sudden, decisive violence. He collapsed beside the overturned desk, his eyes already glazing with death, and Lucia ran toward her father with a sob of relief. Dante caught her in his arms, dropping to his knees to hold her properly, his face buried in her dark hair as he whispered reassurances in rapid Italian. Valentina turned to see Marco lowering his rifle, his expression professionally neutral despite having just ended a human life. The rescue operation had lasted less than 10 minutes from start to finish, and Marcus's grand scheme for revenge had crumbled with the efficiency that marked all of Dante's business dealings. Is everyone accounted for? Dante asked, his voice muffled against Lucia's hair. All targets neutralized, Marco replied. No casualties on our side. Police response is being handled through the usual channels. Valentina understood that this meant Dante's connections in law enforcement would ensure that the warehouse incident was classified as gang violence that didn't warrant extensive investigation. Marcus and his hired thugs would be written off as criminals who had died in a dispute over territory or money, and no one would look too closely at the circumstances surrounding their deaths. As they prepared to leave the warehouse, Lucia clinging to both Dante and Valentina with desperate relief, Dante paused to look down at Marcus's body one final time. This is what happens to people who threaten my family, he said quietly, his words meant for both the dead man and the woman beside him. Remember that. But as they walked toward the waiting vehicles, Lucia safe between them and the nightmare finally over, Valentina realized that she felt no horror at the violence she had witnessed. Marcus had chosen to escalate a petty workplace dispute into child endangerment and terrorism. He had made himself a threat to an innocent little girl whose only crime was having a father who loved her enough to fight back. Dante had eliminated that threat with the decisive efficiency that had made him one of the most feared men in Chicago, and Valentina found she was grateful for his capacity for violence rather than frightened by it. I love you, she said as they reached the car, the words torn from her chest by relief and adrenaline and the overwhelming need to say them while she still could. I love you both, and I'm not sorry about any of it. Dante stopped walking and turned to face her, his eyes bright with emotion in the warehouse's harsh security lighting. I love you too, cara mia, he replied, his voice rough with feeling. More than I thought possible. More than I knew how to hope for. Lucia looked between them with the perceptive understanding that seemed to be her constant companion. Are we going to be a real family now? She asked with 80-year-old directness. Like Mama wanted? Yes, Piccola, Dante said, reaching out to pull Valentina against his side. We're going to be a real family. Forever. 6 months after the warehouse, Valentina stood in the gleaming kitchen of Palazzo Romano, watching the afternoon prep crew work with the kind of focused efficiency that made her heart swell with pride. The restaurant that had once been the site of her greatest humiliation had been transformed into something beautiful under her management. A place where families gathered and children were welcome rather than merely tolerated. Dante had kept his promise about buying the restaurant, but he had surprised her by asking her to run it rather than simply owning it as an investment. What had started as a gesture of protection had become a thriving business that bore little resemblance to the cold, unwelcoming establishment Marcus had managed. Warm lighting, comfortable seating areas, and a children's menu complete with crayons and activities had turned Palazzo Romano into the kind of place she had always dreamed of creating. The dinner rush would begin soon, but for now, the restaurant belonged to the quiet satisfaction of preparation and anticipation. Valentina moved between stations, checking seasoning and presentation with the expertise she had gained through months of learning from the professional kitchen staff. Cooking had become more than just a skill. It was a way of showing love, of creating the kind of warmth and welcome she had craved her entire life. A familiar voice called her name from the dining room, and she looked up to see Lucia bounding through the swinging doors with the barely contained energy that marked the end of her school day. At 8.5, she was growing taller and more confident by the day, but she still ran to Valentina for hugs with the enthusiasm of a child who had never doubted that she was loved and wanted. "How was school today, sweetheart?" Valentina asked, wrapping Lucia in a flowery embrace that left white handprints on the little girl's navy blazer. "Mrs. Patterson says I'm reading at a high school level," Lucia announced proudly. "And Tommy Morrison tried to pull my hair, but I told him if he touched me again, my papa would feed him to the fishes." "Lucia," Valentina said with gentle reproof, though she was fighting back a smile. "We've talked about this. You can't threaten your classmates with your father's reputation." "But it worked," Lucia pointed out with 80-year-old logic. "He left me alone for the rest of the day." Before Valentina could formulate an appropriate response to this troubling but effective approach to conflict resolution, Dante appeared in the doorway, still wearing his expensive suit, but with his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up. The sight of him never failed to make her pulse flutter, even after months of living together, of sharing his bed and his life and his complicated world. "Are my girls causing trouble in the kitchen?" he asked with the kind of fond indulgence that had replaced the careful distance he had once maintained between his business life and his family. "Always," Valentina replied, earning a giggle from Lucia and a smile from Dante that made her feel like the most important person in his universe. "Good," Dante said, moving to kiss Lucia's forehead and then Valentina's lips with the casual intimacy of a man who had learned to take happiness when it was offered. "I have something I need to discuss with both of you. Something important." There was a quality to his voice that made Valentina pause in her prep work, a nervousness that was completely at odds with his usual confidence. Lucia seemed to sense it too, looking between them with the perceptive understanding that had marked her since infancy. "Is everything okay?" Valentina asked, concern creeping into her voice. "Is there some kind of problem with business?" "Not business," Dante said quickly. "Personal. Very personal." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box that made Valentina's breath catch in her throat. She had hoped, had dreamed, but seeing the physical evidence of his intentions made everything suddenly, wonderfully real. "Valentina Rossi," Dante said, dropping to one knee beside the prep station with complete disregard for his expensive suit and the flower-covered floor. "You saved my daughter before you even knew her name. You brought joy back into this house when I thought it was lost forever. You made me remember what it feels like to hope for something beyond mere survival." Lucia was practically vibrating with excitement, her hands pressed against her mouth to contain squeals of delight that threatened to interrupt the most important moment of Valentina's life. "I love you with everything I am," Dante continued, opening the box to reveal a stunning diamond surrounded by smaller stones that caught the kitchen's warm light and threw rainbows across the stainless steel surfaces. "I love your courage, your kindness, your strength. I love the way you make Lucia laugh and the way you see the best in people even when they don't deserve it." Tears were streaming down Valentina's face now, and she realized her hands were shaking as she stared at the most beautiful ring she had ever seen. But even more beautiful was the expression on Dante's face, the vulnerability and hope and absolute certainty that this was what he wanted for the rest of his life. "Will you marry me? Will you be Lucia's official mother and my wife and the center of our family forever?" "Yes," Valentina whispered, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, of course, yes." Lucia's squeal of delight echoed through the restaurant as Dante slipped the ring onto Valentina's finger with hands that were surprisingly steady. The diamond fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her specifically, and she marveled at how something so beautiful could be hers to keep. "Can I help plan the wedding?" Lucia asked, bouncing on her toes with excitement. "Can I pick out my dress and the flowers and help make the cake?" "You can help with everything, Piccola," Dante said, rising to wrap both his girls in his arms. "This is our family, which means we make all the big decisions together." The next few months passed in a whirlwind of wedding planning that involved far more input from an 80-year-old than Valentina had expected. Lucia had strong opinions about flowers, decisive preferences regarding cake flavors, and an unwavering insistence that the ceremony should take place in the garden where her mother's roses bloomed most beautifully. Dante's family embraced Valentina with the kind of warm acceptance she had never experienced before. His mother, Elena, was a small but formidable woman who took one look at the way her son smiled when Valentina was nearby and declared her perfect for the family. His brothers and their wives included her in their close-knit group without question, and their children immediately adopted her as another beloved aunt. For someone who had spent most of her life feeling like an outsider, belonging to something as warm and encompassing as the Torino family was overwhelming in the best possible way. These were people who protected each other fiercely, who celebrated each other's successes and provided comfort during difficulties. They had made room for her at their table and in their hearts with the generous assumption that anyone Dante loved was automatically worthy of their love as well. The wedding took place on a perfect October afternoon when the garden was ablaze with autumn color and Isabella's roses provided a fragrant backdrop for the simple ceremony. Valentina wore a dress of ivory silk that Lucia had helped choose, and Dante looked devastatingly handsome in a black tuxedo that made his green-gray eyes appear almost silver in the afternoon light. The guest list was small but meaningful. Family, close friends, and the core members of Dante's crew who had become extended family over the years. Father Michael, who had known Dante since childhood and understood the complexities of his life without judgment, performed a ceremony that was both traditional and deeply personal. When Dante spoke his vows, his voice was steady and sure as he promised to love, protect, and cherish Valentina for the rest of his life. When she responded with her own vows, promising to stand beside him through whatever challenges their complicated world might bring, there wasn't a dry eye among their guests. But the moment that would stay with Valentina forever came when Lucia stepped forward during the ring exchange, carrying a small velvet box that contained a delicate gold band set with tiny diamonds. "This is for you," she said to Valentina with 80-year-old solemnity. "It's a promise ring, like Papa's wedding ring, but it's a promise that you'll always be my mama, even if you and Papa have babies together someday." The gesture was so thoughtful, so perfectly Lucia, that Valentina found herself crying again as she accepted the ring and the enormous responsibility it represented. Being Dante's wife was wonderful, but being Lucia's mother was the greatest honor of her life. 1 year later, Valentina stood in the same garden, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her belly as she watched Lucia practice cartwheels with the determined concentration she brought to everything she deemed important. The little girl was so excited about becoming a big sister that she had already started reading parenting books and making lists of everything she planned to teach the baby. "You're thinking very seriously about something," Dante observed, moving to stand behind Valentina and wrapping his arms around her from behind. His hands settled over hers on her belly, and she felt their child respond to the familiar warmth of his touch with a flutter of movement that never failed to amaze her. "I was just thinking about how different everything is now," Valentina replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. "A year ago, I was a waitress who couldn't imagine having a family of my own. Now I'm married to the most amazing man in the world. I'm the mother of the most wonderful little girl, and we're about to welcome a baby who will grow up surrounded by so much love. Do you ever regret it?" Dante asked quietly. "The chaos and complications that come with being part of my world?" Never, Valentina said firmly, turning in his arms to face him directly. Every day I wake up grateful that Marcus was cruel enough to Lucia that night to make me brave enough to intervene. If he hadn't been such a monster, we might never have found each other. Dante's smile was soft with the kind of contentment he had never expected to feel again after Isabella's death. God works in mysterious ways, he said, even using terrible people to bring good things into our lives. Mama, look, Lucia called from across the garden, executing a perfect cartwheel that ended with her arms raised in triumph. Did you see? I didn't wobble at all this time. That was perfect, sweetheart, Valentina called back, applauding with genuine enthusiasm. You're getting so good at those. As they watched Lucia continue her practice with the single-minded determination she had inherited from her father, Dante rested his forehead against Valentina's and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. I love you, Valentina Torino, he said, using her married name with the kind of satisfaction that made her heart skip. Thank you for giving me back my faith in happiness. Thank you for showing me what real love looks like, she replied, then smiled as their baby kicked strongly enough to make them both laugh. I think someone wants to join the conversation. Smart baby, Dante said with a grin. Already knows the most important thing in life is family. As the sun set over Isabella's garden and Lucia's laughter echoed across the grounds they all called home, Valentina reflected on how perfectly everything had worked out despite the violence and chaos that had brought them together. Marcus had intended to destroy their happiness, but instead, his cruelty had created the circumstances that allowed them to find each other. Sometimes the worst moments in life were simply the beginning of the best ones, and sometimes standing up for what was right, even when it cost everything, was the first step toward finding everything you never knew you wanted. Their story had started with a frightened little girl, a protective stranger, and a desperate act of kindness in a restaurant where children weren't particularly welcome. Now they were a family bound together by love, protected by devotion, and strengthened by the knowledge that they would face whatever came next together. And as Valentina watched her husband and daughter plan tomorrow's adventures, while their unborn child moved restlessly beneath her heart, she knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly where she belonged. Home wasn't a place, after all. It was these people, this love, this sense of belonging that had been worth every risk she had taken to find it. What about you? Have you ever had a moment where doing the right thing changed everything? I'd love to hear your stories about times when courage led to unexpected happiness. Share your experiences in the comments because sometimes we all need reminders that standing up for others can transform our own lives in ways we never imagined.